So thank you, Rob, for your leadership. What Rob and Mohan have done, as you all know better than I, since this is my first kin. How many of you are, first kins again? All right. Oh, thank God I'm not alone. So in some ways it's odd to get up and give remarks to people who've done this before, but you don't know what's coming. But that said, the number of stories, the energy that I've picked up traveling around the globe about what happens at KIN, what happens out of this vision that Mohan had in partnership with Rob to create a very different dialogue, a very different way of thinking and talking and energizing people right here out of the Allen Center with cool lights and a rug, is pretty terrific. And it's had an amazing legacy. And when you walk into a role new, you look for the collection of things, there are these unbelievable gems that not enough people know about. And I would argue that KIN is number one on my list of unbelievable gems that not enough people know about. As a dean, one of the things that people always want to ask you about is what is your school doing on innovation and entrepreneurship? And that's why KIN becomes so important, because I don't know of any other major business school that's having this kind of dialogue, this kind of impact. And it fits in very nicely with our legacy at Kellogg of always trying to take a different path, think differently about the practice of business education, think differently about how you convene people. Even this Allen Center building, in case you didn't know, was one of the first of its kind in executive education in our space. It really set the bar for what executive education was going to start looking like in the 1970s. So it's a deep and rich legacy that I get to be part of, and a deep and rich legacy that we get to stand for and build on as we sit in this room. I wanted to just share a couple thoughts that we've been talking a lot about here at Kellogg over the last 6 months as we finished a strategic planning process, trying to think about how we should structure ourselves, both our thought leadership, our education, our community building, as we go forward in a very different time and very different place. And one of the biggest insights that I learned from the 9-month strategic planning process that engaged over 1,000 people around the world, and thanks to we're not pitching consulting firms here, right? The 3 that did the pro bono work, but thank you, you know who you are, in collecting data and doing deep dives with us. There was a huge insight to me that we as a team had to look at when we were asking is, how big a change trajectory should we be setting for Kellogg as we really push out into the 21st century? Are we talking about incremental change or significant step-level change? And in making that decision, which came a little bit more towards significant and a lot further from incremental, which, as you know, is a blessing and a curse as a leader, was the recognition that we haven't heard that many people talk about just how powerful the transition into the 21st century has been for our world. In fact, I would argue that you would be hard-pressed to find another time in human history when we changed millennia, when this much change happened. And you can say, well, how often have we changed millennia? Right? And so it's almost by definition, given the fact that sort of how the rate of change has happened, that you're going to expect more change at the change of this millennia than in the dark ages, the last time we did it. But even just in changing decades, even changing centuries, like we did in 1900, it took World War I to bring us into the 20th century. But it is much more astounding that 2001 to 2011 decade, if you look at it, is almost like a wormhole in human history. In 1999, if you recall, we were worried about Y2K. How many of you hired Y2K consultants, right? Lots of you. And we were worried about the dot-com bubble. I don't know about you, but those seem like much gentler times than when I think about I'm reading every single day in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Financial Times. If I just look at 4 months in 2001, starting with September 11th, for those of us that were there in New York City, we can't forget it. Even if we watched on TV, you can't forget it. Only 2 months later, in November 2011, Goldman wrote the paper on naming the brick. That was only in November 2011 that the brick was named. And at that time, they predicted that those countries would account for 10% of world GDP by the end of the decade. And as you all know, they accounted for pretty close to 20% of world GDP by the end of that decade. So you had 9/11, you had the naming of the brick in 2001 in November, and it was only on January 1st, 2002, that the physical euro went public. Now, if you look at how we begin that decade and how we ended it, with all the wars that resulted because of September 11th, because of all the growth that happened in the emerging economies in that decade, when you look at what has happened to the euro, which has us all deeply troubled for several years to come, not to mention the fall of Arthur Andersen, the fall of Lehman Brothers, the fall of Bear Stearns, the Southern Asian tsunami, Hurricane Katrina, the Japanese earthquake, some of the largest catastrophes in recorded human history, it's very difficult to argue that that decade was not, in fact, a deep birthing moment for this new millennia, of which there is absolutely no going back. We have fundamentally changed how we are organizing with the birth of Facebook, which also happened in that new millennia. It is very hard to argue that the skills and the assets and the processes that you need to have in place now to build organizations that create lasting value are the same ones that you had to have at any point in the 20th century. If you can't figure out how to harness these technology-enabled architectures of collaboration, you can't succeed anymore. And that's a skill set we didn't even know about 10 years ago. So much of success is changing from physical assets to interconnectivity assets, your ability to leverage those assets through your ability to create these much more complex, much more embedded and dense architectures of collaboration. So it's a powerful time, it's an exciting time, and it's a scary time if you're leading a business school. Because we're charged with working with partners like you to educate the next generation of leaders. And we take that task seriously. And I am delighted that you all are here to talk with us and energize us as we do that, because it's a mighty and wonderful responsibility. So I am so glad that we are the convening point. I am so glad that Mohan and Rob had the vision they did along with all their partners, many of whom are here today. And I am, just like all of you, looking forward for the fun to come over the next few hours. Thanks.